You are listening to Robert Fain's podcast.
How is it that a single ancient text can be cited by some as a mandate for absolute peace, while simultaneously being weaponized by extremist leaders as a justification for global violence against non-believers? It's a contradiction that literally shapes our headlines every single day.
Here's a quick roadmap for our analysis today. First up, the question of violence. Second, the specific rules of engagement. Third, the socio-historical context. Fourth, the big academic debate between textualists and contextualists. And finally, how modern artificial intelligence is stepping in. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the question of violence. Does the Quran teach violence or peace?
So let's dive into this. Does the Quran actually teach violence? Or is it fundamentally a manual for peace? There's an undeniable tension right now between public perception, which, let's be honest, is so often driven by isolated, sensational headlines, and the holistic message of the actual source text. We have to look past the modern media soundbites and look directly at what the text itself says. And to do that, we have to start by defining a word you've probably heard a million times on the news, but might not fully know the original, source-based definition of.
That word is jihad. Now, based directly on our sources, the Quranic concept of jihad is actually defined as a peaceful, ideological struggle. It's aimed at bringing about an intellectual revolution, not an armed conflict. In fact, the text itself tells its followers to strive more strenuously with the help of this Quran, meaning the book, the ideas, not a sword, is the tool for reaching people's minds and souls. The original goal here is persuasion, not coercion. Moving to section 2, rules of engagement. Let's examine the text itself.
So if the baseline is peaceful struggle, what is the deal with those jarring, violent verses we hear quoted all the time? Well, check out Quran 2:190-193. It says, "Fight in God's cause against those who wage war against you, but do not commit aggression." We constantly hear phrases like, "slay them wherever you find them," quoted totally out of context. But right here in the text, we see these commands were bound by incredibly strict limitations. They were highly limited rules of self-defense against unilateral attackers who were actively trying to wipe out the early Muslim community. It was absolutely not a blanket command to just fight non-believers or infidels. Ignoring these strict, built-in limitations is literally the very first step extremist groups take to justify unchecked violence today.
And why was this defensive fighting even authorized in the first place? Because of this concept right here, fitna. Fitna means severe religious persecution or a coercive religious system. The text explicitly states that this kind of persecution is, quote, worse than killing. So these defensive battles were historically authorized for a very limited duration, specifically to end fitna and establish a society where people actually had intellectual freedom. Once the persecution stopped, the text says the fighting had to stop immediately, no exceptions.
Now, you might also be wondering about verses detailing severe punishments, like in Quran 5:33 and 34. But again, look closely at the specific target here. This is aimed at those who wage war against God and spread disorder in the land. Our sources point out that these were essentially severe deterrents aimed at hardcore criminals spreading terror, armed robbery, and extreme disorder in society. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of high treason. It was never a general mandate against people of other faiths. Let's move to section 3. The socio-historical context. We need to zoom out to the entire 23-year revelation. Because, texts don't exist in a vacuum. To truly grasp these rules of engagement, we have to look at the broader theological and historical environment of 7th century Arabia. When we map out how the text was revealed over 23 years, the timeline is incredibly telling. In year 1, the revelation kicks off with strictly peaceful teachings, focusing on morality, justice, and helping the poor. And that peaceful period lasts for 20 solid years, even in the face of brutal, aggressive persecution. It's not until year 20, after the community is literally driven from their homes, that a 3-year exceptional period of defensive war is authorized. So mathematically speaking, peaceful commands were the 20-year norm, while the war commands were just a 3-year exception tied strictly to a state of emergency.
Which brings us to Section 4, textualists versus contextualists. This is about how differing frameworks completely change interpretation. This right here is the absolute climax of our explainer today. It is the core academic debate happening around the world. Exactly how should this ancient text be read today? It all boils down to this divide between two interpretive frameworks. On one side, we have the textualists. They rely purely on literal, linguistic criteria. To them, the text's ethical legal meaning is fixed and universally applicable, forever, totally regardless of history. On the other side, we have the contextualists. They argue that interpretation absolutely must account for the socio-historical reality of the 7th century to find the underlying moral reasons for a rule. Think about it. If you apply the textualist framework, like certain factions within the Muslim Brotherhood might do, you strip verses of their 7th century context, and suddenly it's incredibly easy to weaponize temporary self-defense rules into a perpetual, violent mandate against non-believers today. But if you apply the contextualist framework, you harmonize those exact same verses right back to their original intent of peace and self-defense. As one of our sources notes, the Quran is in the language of Mecca and surrounding regions, embedded in the context in which it was received. The contextualist view really emphasizes that God provided rulings responsive to very specific ancient situations, like 7th century tribal warfare, as a tool to teach broader, highly adaptable moral objectives. The specific ancient ruling might change, but the underlying moral value, that remains permanent.
So contextualist scholars actually propose a fascinating three-step method to keep the ancient text relevant and peaceful today. Step 1, they elicit general principles from those specific 7th century rulings. Step 2, they develop a unified socio-moral theory based on those principles, like prioritizing justice and peace. And Step 3, they apply those underlying reasons to our contemporary needs and circumstances. It's really about honoring the spirit of the text rather than freezing society in the past.
Let's move to our final section, Section 5, Modern AI, Ancient Texts, Restoring Historical Context Through Technology.
You might be wondering, with so much history to parse, how do scholars actually verify these contexts today? Well, cutting-edge technology is jumping in to settle these interpretive debates. Just look at this punchy metric, 184,000. That is the massive number of hadiths, or historical sayings and traditions, that have been verified, retranslated, and approved out of a staggering 284,000 in a brand new database project.
And this brilliantly illustrates the intersection of tech and theology. Launched by Andakuzmais University, this project actually uses machine learning to detect the true essence of historical narratives. It restores distorted texts that have been removed from their context right back to their actual historical reality. The goal here is absolutely vital. By using tech to prove exactly why a text was stated historically, they can actively prevent the modern weaponization of isolated quotes. It stops bad actors from exploiting the text to justify extremist violence.
Which leaves us with this profound thought to close on. Does an ancient text's meaning belong strictly to the era it was written or the era of the reader? As we've seen today, whether you read a text literally or contextually changes absolutely everything, from global politics all the way down to personal faith.
You are listening to Robert Fain's podcast.